In late February 1836, the most famous battle of the Texas Revolution began with the siege of the Alamo Mission. Defended by fewer than 300 Texans, the walls of the mission had been turned into a makeshift fort. Its defenders included Colonel William Travis, James Bowie, and former U.S. Congressman and folk legend Davy Crockett. The Texans were surrounded on all sides and besieged for 13 days by Santa Anna's army before the final night attack on March 6, 1836. The battle was brutal, and Santa Anna ordered for there to be no prisoners taken. The handful of prisoners who managed to survive the massacre were executed as well. The Battle of the Alamo became a rallying cry for the Texans still fighting, and fueled the Texas Army in the weeks which followed. A little more than a month later, the Texas Revolution ended in victory for the people of Texas after the Battle of San Jacinto in April 1836. The Texas Revolution lasted less than a year and saw the creation of the Republic of Texas. Naturally, the predominantly American population immediately began petitioning the government of the United States to annex the new republic and add it to the growing Union. Despite fierce arguments over the admittance of what would undeniably be another slave state into the Union, it took less than a decade before Texas was annexed by the United States. The annexation of Texas sparked yet another conflict with Mexico in 1846. Because the borders of the Republic of Texas were undefined and disputed by Mexico, when the United States annexed Texas, Mexico claimed that the United States was taking Mexican land. President James K. Polk attempted to negotiate with the Mexican government, offering to pay for the disputed territory in addition to the California, New Mexico, and Arizona territories. However, the Mexican government refused. In response, Polk sent troops to occupy the disputed territory, causing Mexican forces to attack the small American force. Polk used the affair to convince Congress to declare war on Mexico. Mexico's army was equipped with surplus flintlock firearms from the Napoleonic era, while the United States was armed with far more modern weaponry. Disorganized, undersupplied, and facing internal political strife at every level of management, the Mexican forces were little to no match for the American Army and Navy, who made quick work conquering vast sections of Mexico and its territories. When the Mexican government finally collapsed, they were forced to surrender large swaths of territory to the United States, including California and New Mexico, in addition to suffering the indignity of having to recognize the sovereignty of the Republic of Texas and its subsequent annexation in 1845. Lasting from April 1846 to February 1848, the Mexican-American War proved to be a one-sided one, and clearly displayed America's ambitions to secure control of the North American continent. There were many dissidents to the concept of manifest destiny, especially within the Whig Party, the successors of the Federalists, including, by the mid-19th century, a young Illinois politician named Abraham Lincoln. In 1844, manifest destiny took center stage as territorial disputes with Great Britain over Oregon and the ongoing tensions with Mexico over the Texas Territory split political parties further. As Western territories grew in population and were being considered for admission to the Union, whether these areas would allow or ban slavery became a crucial question. The fragile balance of power in Congress between slave states and free states was at risk. Since the first African slaves arrived in Virginia in 1619, the institution of slavery had grown more and more ingrained in the culture and economy of the United States, particularly in the South. While the United States government had abolished the slave trade in 1808, it had introduced a form of chattel slavery within its borders, ensuring generations of African Americans remained working. While there had been a few slave rebellions across the United States in the early 19th century, including Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion, none had succeeded. Through the early 19th century, some slaves attempted to escape and fled north, hoping to find sanctuary in the pro-abolition states of the Northeast, or in Canada. They traveled north on a series of secret routes to known abolitionist locations and safe houses. Known as the Underground Railroad, the pathway north was dangerous, and those brave enough to flee bondage were aided by fellow escaped slaves, freedmen, and women, and anti-slavery sympathizers. One such individual was Harriet Tubman. Tubman had escaped slavery herself in 1849 and spent many years after aiding more than 70 slaves escaping slavery in the South. As the issue of slavery pressed closer and closer to a breaking point, so too did the tension within the federal government. In 1854, South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks caned Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner on the floor of the Senate. Pro-slavery sympathizers from around the country sent Brooks new canes congratulating him. Abolitionists saw the public attack as the embodiment of the control the South seemed to have over the country. Could they simply do whatever they wanted and expect nothing but compromise in return? The polarization of the country was made perfectly clear as a result of the incident. It had taken years of agreements and compromises to come to this stalemate. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise declared that Missouri would be a new slave state and Maine as a new free state, and that slavery would be prohibited north of the southern boundary of Missouri in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase. The fragile balance was preserved. Texas joined in 1844 as a slave state, and Oregon was admitted in 1846 as a free state. When the U.S. won more than 1 million square miles of territory from Mexico as a result of the Mexican-American War in 1848, volatile debate occurred over whether the new territories would allow slavery. The U.S. gained all of present-day California, Texas, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah as a result of that fight. The resulting agreement said that California would be a free state, and the slave trade, but not slavery, would be abolished in Washington, D.C. But a new Fugitive Slave Act would enable Southerners to reclaim runaway slaves who had escaped across borders to free states. The agreement allowed the rest of the areas to determine for themselves whether to allow slavery. In 1854, two new states, Kansas and Nebraska, were set to be established in the Louisiana Purchase area. But Southern legislators objected because, according to the terms of the Missouri Compromise, both states would be free. A new compromise called for popular sovereignty, or once again allowing the settlers of the territories to determine the question for themselves. The battle for Kansas and Nebraska came to embody the soul of the nation. People flooded to the territories and tried to influence the vote, many of them voting illegally. Soon, Kansas spiraled into civil war, a conflict that killed hundreds and which became known as Bleeding Kansas. Among those who had joined in the violence was one of the most notorious freedom fighters in American history, John Brown. Brown was a radical preacher and a staunch abolitionist. He had on multiple occasions attempted to incite an armed slave rebellion, and in Kansas ramped up the violence to such an extent that he and his followers hacked 5 Kansan slave owners to death with broadswords. Brown then began planning a raid on Harper's Ferry in Virginia, hoping to once again inspire the enslaved peoples of the South to rise up against their oppressors. He planned on capturing the armory and arsenal in Harper's Ferry, in addition to the rifle factory, in order to arm his rebellion. Brown's raid commenced in October 1859 and was swiftly put down by the United States Army. The U.S. forces, led by a young colonel named Robert E. Lee, quickly surrounded the engine house Brown's men had occupied, and after Brown refused to surrender, took the building by force. Brown was tried and executed for treason by the state of Virginia, and in so doing became a martyr for anti-slave forces around the country. Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was a defining moment for the country. It seemed now inevitable that there would be some great conflict to decide the fate of the nation. The election of 1860 was the final straw for the South. Republican presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln ran on a platform of liberal policies, which included raising tariffs, infrastructure improvements, and expanding the railroads. While Lincoln was an abolitionist and vehemently opposed slavery, he understood that the issue would inevitably tear the country apart, and had initially promised to do everything in his power to keep the South from breaking away from the Union. Lincoln's election to the presidency, however, was enough for some southern states to make the break. In December 1860, South Carolina led the charge and seceded from the United States. Other southern states quickly followed, and sitting President James Buchanan faced a growing disaster. As southern states seceded, they began to confiscate federal forts and arsenals which belonged to the United States military. One such location was Fort Sumter in South Carolina. President Buchanan had been unwilling to resupply the garrison, and when Lincoln took office, he faced a near impossible decision. Lincoln, unwilling to surrender an American fort to the rebels or recognize their authority, sent a letter to the governor of South Carolina informing him that a ship carrying food but no ammunition would attempt to resupply the fort. This allowed Lincoln the satisfaction of knowing that if the South fired on the fort, they would be the aggressor in any conflict, and if they did not, he would have made strides in negotiating with the rebels, as well as holding the fort. It was not to be. On the 9th of April, Confederate President Jefferson Davis ordered General P.T.G. Beauregard to take the fort before the supplies would arrive. On April 12, 1861, the standoff finally erupted when Beauregard at last opened fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment lasted 34 hours with more than 4,000 shells fired. Despite the ferocity of the bombardment, not a single Union soldier was killed during the action. At 2:30 p.m. on April 13, 1861, they surrendered the fort under agreeable terms and marched from the fort carrying the flag which had endured the battle. For Lincoln, the loss of Fort Sumter was a kind of symbolic victory. While losing the fort was not ideal, the public in the North rallied behind him and the Union. States like New Jersey and Delaware, which had been for a time on the fence regarding secession, threw their support wholeheartedly toward the Union. Lincoln used the momentum carried by the battle to call for 75,000 volunteers willing to help restore order in the South and return the secessionist states to the Union. The North answered the call, and in days, the ranks were beginning to fill. In Ohio, so many men volunteered that they could have met the full 75,000 volunteers on their own. In the South, the victory at Fort Sumter did less to inspire a call to arms than did Lincoln's call for volunteers. The call for 75,000 volunteers triggered the secession of 4 additional states: Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina. To the South, it was clear that Lincoln planned to use the federal government to coerce them back into the Union by blood. In the North, it was clear that the South had violated the Constitution by seceding, and it was within the power of the federal government to take back the states.